But apparently, the God whom Dr. Craig is asking us to believe as the creator very much wants people to believe in a certain way, and he wants this so much that he's prepared to torture them forever for punishment for not obeying me. Well, it seems to me that anyone who knew that that was what this cosmic Saddam Hussein wanted would behave like the sensible subjects of Saddam Hussein. They'll say anything about his merits and goodness. Oh, yes. Well, wouldn't you if you were going to fall into the hands of his torturers? But omnipotence could avoid all this by simply making them creatures such that they would choose to obey him. How nice. This is an argument which I think may give Dr. Craig a little pause. Yes, what can we do briefly? Yes, about design. Everyone has heard of the argument to design, about how if we found a watch in the bush, we'd infer that this was the product of design and so on. But surely the reason why we infer that something was made by an intelligent being is not the complexity, it's simply that it is an artifact, obviously an artifact and not a natural phenomenon. The most complicated, sophisticated entities in the whole universe are entities of a sort of which I see about 3,000 around here. And they were not, at least within the universe itself, designed. They were, at least within the universe itself, we were, products of unconscious physical and mechanical forces. This argument for design within the universe, the argument from design outside the universe is another one, and I won't try in the remaining 30 seconds to deal with that one now. Another time, another argument.
You'll remember in my first speech, I argued that there are no good reasons to think that atheism is true, and that there are good reasons to think that theism is true. Now, I asked Dr. Flew to give us good arguments to show that God does not exist. As I listened to the first speech, I basically distilled three arguments that he offered. Number one is that if God is omnipotent, then why don't things turn out as God wills? It seems to me that the answer to that question is evident, namely, God's omnipotence does not mean that he can do things that are logically impossible, but it is logically impossible to make someone freely do something. Libertarian freedom entails freedom from causal restraints, and therefore if we are truly free and God is willed to create free creatures, then he cannot guarantee how free creatures will choose. In other words, Dr. Flew's fallacy is thinking that because there are logically possible worlds in which everyone always does what God wants, that those worlds are feasible for God to create. But it may well be the case that any time God would try to create such a logically possible world, the creatures would freely go wrong and would not do what God wants. And even an omnipotent being cannot make someone freely do something. So I think the first argument is simply fallacious. Secondly, he argued that the doctrine of God's love and justice is incompatible with the doctrine of hell, particularly because the punishment is not proportionate to the crime. Well, let me say two things about that. First of all, this isn't the topic of the debate this evening. The subject of the debate is the existence of God. What this argument would show is that the doctrine of hell is false, not that God does not exist. But in fact, as a Christian theist who believes in the doctrine of hell, let me say something in defense of it anyway. Number one, this is related to the problem that we just mentioned a moment ago, namely, people freely separate themselves from God forever. It isn't that God sends people to hell. Rather, it's that people freely reject God's grace and forgiveness, and so they separate themselves from God forever. If eternal punishment were for finite sins in this life, then I agree it would be disproportionate. But the biblical view is that people of their own free will reject God and his forgiveness, and so they separate themselves from God forever. Second point I'd like to make is, if a person committed an infinite number of sins, then he would deserve eternal punishment. Now, no one obviously commits an infinite number of sins in this life, but what about in the afterlife? Insofar as the damned in hell continue to hate and reject God, they continue to sin, and thus they incur further punishment. And thus, in a real sense, hell is self-perpetuating rather, because the sinning goes on forever, the punishment goes on forever. Thirdly, I want to suggest that there may be, in fact, a sin of infinite gravity and proportion, which does merit eternal punishment. And this would be the sin of irrevocably rejecting God and his forgiveness. It seems to me that for the creature to spit in the face of God, his creator, to reject God irrevocably, is a sin of infinite proportion and could well merit eternal punishment. So even though this isn't the topic of the debate tonight, I think that no arguments have been given to show that the doctrine of hell is incompatible with God's love and justice. The biblical view is that God wants every single person to know him and his love and his salvation forever. And the only reason that will isn't fulfilled is because of human freedom. Now, the third argument that Dr.
If we intersperse on either side applause throughout the midst of the debate, we will extend the debate to excessive time. Please, if you would, reserve applause for the breaks between the sections of the debate. Thank you.
The third argument offered by Dr. Flew was that the notion of a bodiless person is impossible. But I have two responses to this. In the first place, notice that he gave no proof of this. He gave no argument. He just asserted it's impossible. I want to see a proof of that. Secondly, I would argue that we are acquainted with our own selves as immaterial persons. You see, reductive materialism, which says that the mind is the same as the brain, just doesn't work, because mental properties are clearly distinct from physical properties. For example, the brain is not sad, but a person is sad. A mental property is different than a physical property. A thought doesn't have a weight or a spatial location. So reductive materialism just won't work. What about another view called epiphenomenalism, the idea that the physical brain has mental properties which supervene on it? Well, this is simply incompatible with such things as self-identity over time, or intentional states where one intends to do something, because on this view, mental states are just sort of an excrescent of the brain, not really a self which intends to do anything. It's incompatible with free will, because there's no way these mental epiphenomenal states can freely choose anything or do anything to affect the brain. So that view seems to me to be implausible. I think the best view is some sort of dualism interactionism, that we act as agents to cause physical events in the world. We ourselves are immaterial selves embodied, and God would be an immaterial self or mind which is not embodied. And so far from being implausible, I think that this is the most plausible view of human beings, and it applies to God as well. So basically, I don't think any of these reasons for atheism that we've seen tonight are very compelling. I don't find them persuasive.